This is Module 3, Learning Objective 3. So now we're going to talk about disaggregating return on assets. We've already talked about disaggregating return on equity, and we said there's two components to that, right? One component is return on assets, and the other is financial leverage. Now let's go into return on assets a little further, because that can be broken down into another piece. Specifically, return on assets can be broken into a component of profit margin versus asset turnover. And I've talked about this in a previous video, that basically you can make money in one of two ways. One is by raising your prices and having a higher profit margin, and the other is by selling more stuff. So, and most companies go in one direction or another. As I showed you a chart previously, most companies go in one direction or the other. Either they have they've managed to create barriers to competition and they can raise their prices and consumers are willing to pay more money for their products, or they have a very low profit margin. Again, that company example I used was Tiffany. You go into a Tiffany store, they don't sell very much stuff, but it's expensive. On the other hand, asset turnover would be where a company does a very high volume, but they probably have a low profit margin. Like a supermarket would be good example of that. They're two completely different business models. Some companies try to bridge them, but most companies go in one direction or another. And sometimes companies compete against each other in different directions. So if you have a Whole Foods versus Costco, Whole Foods is really a profit margin business and its food's very expensive. Costco is really a volume measure, and they may sell similar products, but Costco is trying to sell volume and Whole Foods is jacking up the price. They're two different models. So most companies would go in one direction or another, and these are two different ways of making return on assets. So profit margin, net income divided by sales, would measure how much the company makes on each sales dollar, whereas asset turnover is the sales level divided by assets. And let me talk a little bit more about asset turnover for a moment, because most business majors don't realize how important turnover is. And we're going to see how important it is in a few minutes. Turnover is the idea that you try to squeeze as much sales out of the assets you have. Your investors, your stockholders, have invested a certain amount of money in your company, and you've borrowed even more money. So whatever money the business has costs you money. If it's debt, you have to pay interest on it. If it's stockholders' equity, then that's a share of equity, and they own the company, and they're also entitled to dividends. So assets are valuable, and you don't want to have assets that you're not using. In fact, the objective of a well-run business is to use all your assets as productively as you possibly can, and not to let assets sit around. You don't want to have excess inventory that's not going to be sold quickly. You don't want to have real estate that you're not using. Empty office space is a waste of money. You certainly don't want to rent space but you don't want to own anything that you're not using, because that's a waste. They borrowed money to do that, and you're paying interest on it, or you're paying dividends. So the idea of asset turnover is you want to use your assets as productively as possible. When I think about asset turnover, again, I think about Costco or Walmart, and I think about, if you've ever been to the Walmart in Secaucus, it's always, you can go there at 3 a.m. and it's still completely nuts there. And there's these long lines at the cash register, and people are just loading up their carts with stuff. And the place is like a giant, there's just merchandise. You could see the merchandise flowing out of the store. And I'm sure there's trucks lined up unloading more merchandise for people to buy. And that's the whole idea of Walmart, to move as much merchandise as they possibly can, given the amount of space. And if you look at the store itself, it's actually, even though the store is humongous, it's actually very crowded. It's not only crowded with people, but it's crowded with stuff. And that's part of the Walmart approach, because Walmart wants to use every square foot of floor space to generate more sales. If they're not using space to generate sales, then that's a waste of space. So the idea of asset turnover is that you want to create as much sales with as few assets as possible. And so a manager has control over these three things. One, how much assets you use. Two, how much sales you squeeze out of your assets. And then also how high you make your prices, what your profit margin is going to be. Now, this all then multiplies together. Return on equity breaks into two ratios, return on assets and financial leverage. And then within that, within return on assets, you have two components. You have what's called profitability and what's called productivity. And in fact, you can break these down into for additional ratios, which will build up towards these things. But these top three levels that you see here, return on equity breaking into these two, return on assets breaking into profitability and productivity, is the key to understanding any company. And you can get a tremendous understanding of what a company is really doing just by calculating these numbers and looking at them carefully and comparing them with other companies. Here are some other profitability measures. There's gross profit margin, and this is kind of your markup on cost. So we think of two ratios actually that measure markup. One is net profit margin, which is also called return on sales. And then there's gross profit margin. The difference is gross profit margin looks only at cost of sales, whereas return on sales looks at the company's total sales. Anyway, gross profit margin, and we like a high gross profit margin, of course, and we want it to increase, providing the company has that high has a high markup strategy. Some companies don't want to have such a gross profit margin, such a high one, because that would indicate their prices are getting too high. Operating expense margin, the book is really into this, looks at operating costs, and that would be total operating expenses except for cost of goods sold divided by sales. And we would want to compare them between companies. We also have what's called a cash conversion cycle. So you would take the days sales outstanding plus the days inventory outstanding minus days payable outstanding to get the cash conversion cycle. So an example of this here would be Apple, which we saw before. And here is Merck, which is a little more reasonable. And it takes 123. And the way you would interpret this is that the company, the period of time between when the company pays for raw materials and when it collects the money from its customers, how long does that take for the same item, for the items? So it pays its suppliers for certain raw materials. It processes the raw materials, puts them onto the sales floor, delivers them to the customer, and the customer pays them. How long does that take? And here you can see for Merck, it went down from 155 days to 123 days. The longer that takes, the more money you need to run your company. Another analysis would be PP&E. So lower PP&E turnover, and PP&E turnover would be sales divided by PP&E, by average PP&E, excuse me. So a lower level of PP&E turnover would indicate that you need more capital. And so again, this goes back to the idea of turnover. You want to use your PP&E as productively as possible. And companies need to be careful with financial leverage, because financial leverage is risk. So the more money you borrow, the more money you have to pay back, and the more interest that you have to pay. And if you don't have enough money to pay that interest, then you go out of business. So additional ratios that we use to analyze financial leverage are the liabilities to equity ratio, or the times interest ratio. I'll tell you, I don't like either of these. I kind of like the liability to asset ratio. Total liabilities divided by total assets. I happen to like this ratio, which isn't in the slides, but I'll share it with you anyway. I like the times interest ratio too. That's earnings before interest and taxes divided by interest expense. What it says is how many times over could you pay your interest expense? And now, so that's the DuPont model, and that's the traditional financial statement analysis model. And what I think is really interesting about it is the conclusion that there's a multiplicative effect between with profitability, productivity or turnover, and financial leverage. And a company can achieve return on equity through a combination of these three items. And really any one of them, if any one of them is strong, then that can make the company very profitable. It's very rare for a company to be able to get profitability and productivity to be strong. And financial leverage is so dangerous that if the company already has risk in its operations, then it probably can't handle more risk in financial leverage.